Hello, friends, and welcome to North Shore Whispers. Here, we revisit strange and often forgotten accounts printed long ago in small newspapers across the American Midwest. Ghost stories, mysteries, disappearances, and other matters that were once considered highly irregular. So, if that's the sort of thing that appeals to you, you're certainly welcome to stay a while. Tonight's accounts come from the Thursday, April 15th, 1925 edition of the Wisconsin State Journal. The names of the authors, sadly, are lost to time. So with that said, go ahead and get comfortable, and we'll begin. Story 1. Tamarack Pond. This first account concerns a stretch of land near a place called Tamarack Pond, at a time when much of the surrounding country was still being cleared by newly arrived Europeans. Years ago, a man named Emery purchased a section of wooded land and began building a life there with his wife and 2 daughters. Their home stood some distance from the water, and beyond it, near the shore of the pond, another small house was erected. A man called Ames moved into that house with his wife. Before long, a young woman came to live with them, about the same age as the eldest Emery daughter. The 2 girls became close, visiting one another often. Over time, however, Miss Emery noticed something had changed. There seemed to be a quiet strain between the young woman and Mrs. Ames. Nothing was said openly, but something in the air had shifted. Then, the young woman disappeared. When asked, the Ames couple gave no satisfactory explanation. Neighbors grew uneasy. Some suspected she had simply moved on. Others were not so certain. Soon afterward, the Ames family left their house in the night without notice. The home near Tamarack Pond stood empty. It was not long before whispers began. One evening, returning home late, Mr. Emery passed the vacant house and saw a faint light moving within it. No one lived there. He stepped closer and looked through the window. Inside, he saw the figure of a young woman in a faded dress, moving slowly across the room. She paused, and a low sound, something like a sob, seemed to drift through the stillness. Then she was gone. A few nights later, the Emery daughters passed the same house. Near midnight, a cry broke the silence. A pale figure emerged from the doorway and moved toward a small cluster of trees beside the yard. The girls later said the figure turned once, as though looking back at them, before disappearing. Mr. Emery decided to spend a night in the house himself. For hours, nothing stirred. Then he heard the faint sound of a woman's voice, followed by a struggle in the adjoining room. A choking sound. Then silence. He opened the door, and the same figure stood before him, arms outstretched as though pleading. It moved toward the garden and drifted to the cluster of trees. There, it vanished. At dawn, Mr. Emery gathered neighbors and began to dig beside those very trees. Before long, they uncovered a box. Inside lay the body of the missing girl. In that countryside, Few doubted what had taken place at Tamarack Pond, and some say now, in quiet places where the water lies still, truths have a way of returning to the surface. Story 2: The Peddler in the Woods. Long before paved roads and passing headlights, traveling peddlers made their way between isolated farmhouses, selling small goods from wagons that creaked along narrow dirt paths. One such peddler left a town shortly after 8 o'clock one evening, carrying a considerable sum of money from his day's trade. His route took him through a thick stretch of woods. As he traveled deeper into the forest, unease settled over him. The road narrowed. The trees pressed close. The sound of wheels against earth seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet. Not long after, several men stepped in from the trees. They stopped the wagon. They robbed him. And before the night was over, they ended his life. They buried his body in a shallow grave beside the road. At the end of the grave stood 2 trees, and at the foot 2 more. Years passed. Travelers began reporting a figure dressed in white, moving between those 4 trees. A violinist returning home at 2 a.m. claimed he saw the pale shape standing near the roadside. It lifted an arm slightly, as though beckoning. He did not stop. A farmer and his wife once approached the same place at night. Their horses turned their heads sharply and refused to move forward, trembling despite the rains. The farmer later said he saw something white among the trees. On a winter night, 4 men traveling by sleigh reported that their horse shied violently as a white figure appeared near the grave. The trees marking the spot were never cut down. Some say the spirit of the ill-fated peddler never found peace. Others dismiss the stories as imagination shaped by loneliness and darkness. But even years later, there were those who claimed that on certain nights, something could still be seen moving quietly between the 4 trees. Story 3: The House Near the Lumber Camp. In newly settled country along a river, 2 brothers built a lumber business. As the work grew, they hired a man to help and build a small house for him and his wife. Later, a second worker was employed, a skilled and steady man, respected by others in the trade. He boarded with the first hired man and his wife. Months passed. Then the second worker disappeared. When questioned, those with whom he had lived gave no clear answer. Before long, they left the area entirely. The cabin was rented to another family. One night, the new occupants heard a struggle in the adjoining room. A heavy sound against wood. A muffled cry. The husband opened the door. A pale figure stood there, a dark wound visible at its neck. It moved through the kitchen and out into the yard. The family left the next day. Another man, determined to disprove the stories, spent the night there. Near 10 o'clock, the same sounds began. The door opened. The same figure emerged. On his second night, he brought a friend. Again, the struggle. Again, the same figure. This time it drifted into the garden and paused over a particular spot before fading from view. Not long afterward, the ground there was disturbed. It is said that remains were found. The cabin eventually fell into ruin and was torn down. Yet some claimed that even after the structure was gone, a pale shape could be seen hovering where the garden once lay. In that part of the country, few doubted what had happened. Story 4. The Phantom at the Bend. Not all ghost stories belong to distant centuries. Some are said to follow modern roads. Years ago, a man fled a violent crime in a motor car along a rural highway. With others in hot pursuit, he sped down a narrow road that he did not know well. Ahead lay a sharp bend around a rock face. When approaching, he did not slow. The car struck the rock at tremendous speed and burst into flames. Soon, the wreckage was cleared, and the road reopened. Soon after, travelers began reporting the sound of an engine racing towards the bend late at night. Then, a motor car would appear. It would approach too quickly, and it would fail to turn. And yet, instead of crashing, it seemed to pass through the rock itself, dissolving briefly before reforming beyond it. Some claim to see faint flames around it. If another vehicle stood in its path, the apparition would, invariably, pass straight through. Then the road would be empty again. Some said the driver was condemned to repeat his final flight for eternity. Some simply attributed these sightings to imagination. But even now, there are those who claim that if you stand at a certain bend in the road on a quiet night, you may hear an engine long before you see anything at all. So there you have it, 4 stories from Wisconsin in 1925. I think there's a certain innocence to stories from this time, especially compared to the media available to us in our little corner of time. But I really enjoyed reading them nonetheless. They seem to take a rather blunt and matter-of-fact type of tone with all of these, which definitely comes off differently to us today than I imagine they would have to the people reading them 100 years ago. I also find it interesting that these would appear in a newspaper in April rather than, say, October or even around the holidays. But let me know what you think. This is my very first video, and I'd love to research more of these and, of course, provide narration on this channel moving forward. But okay then. Until next time, this has been North Shore Whispers.